Hello and welcome to our Good Governance webinar on building strong relationships and the role of mediation. Just to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the SCVO website. My name is Tracy Bird and I run the SCVO Information Service and SCVO's trustee network, which we've created to provide support and guidance for members of boards and committees across Scotland. Through the network, you can find information and news on relevant topics with regular e-bulletins and webinars, such as tonight, and e-learning modules and SCVO's own Good Governance Checkup. I'm delighted that we have with us today Julie Hutchison from Aberdeen Standard Capital, who are sponsors of the network. Julie, would you like to say a few words on what we're hoping to achieve with the network and what you think is important in building strong board relationships?
Thanks, Tracy, and hello, everyone. It's lovely that it's not yet completely dark outside. Spring is upon us, which definitely lifts the spirits and the mood. And I think in this online world that we've been living in this last year, there are different things that come to mind with what it means to build strong relationships. So I'll be looking forward to some tips about different things to consider in this context that we're in, but things like mediation and avoiding things reaching a stage that, I think we all saw with a recent infamous Zoom meeting that broke down that was widely shared. I think that's your extreme case scenario that I think charity boards at all costs want to try and avoid. So, in this time when we can't all get together, we're certainly delighted to sponsor and support this series, and I look forward to hearing tonight's comments.
Thanks, Julie. Okay, so we're running these webinars as we recognise that good governance can make or break an organisation. And as the world has changed, it's more important than ever that trustees are supported as they rebuild and recover. And in any rebuilding, strong working relationships and good teamwork are key. So today we're looking at how board behaviour is key to your organisation's success and also to good governance, and how trustees can build a positive board culture. We have with us Scottish Mediation's May Millward, who's going to outline what trustees can do when tensions and conflict arise, and the vital role of mediation should it all go wrong. So 2020, what a year that was. That saw boards challenged in new ways as trustees worked virtually to make difficult decisions and ensure their organisations were governed effectively. I think board dynamics changed and some trustees unfortunately may have saw relationships deteriorate. Now, hopefully none of this has happened to you on your boards, but I'd just like you to take part in a quick poll just to see what in your experience do you think is the main cause of board disputes. Now, you can pick a couple here, they range from personality clashes through poor communication, right up to bullying and discrimination. Hopefully that's not happening to any of you. So just tell us what you think would be the main cause. And if you can think of anything else in your own personal experience, do put that in the chat. So I'm just having a look here. We haven't got any bullying and discrimination up to now, which is good. Confusion over roles and responsibilities. Yeah, so we will be looking at that. Poor communication and personality clashes. So yeah, I think the main reason that you've all said would be confusion over roles and responsibilities. So thanks for taking part in that. Hopefully tonight we can clarify a bit on that. Right now, I'm going to just do a brief run through of what I think are some practical ways that you can tackle these issues. We'll just get rid of the poll. So yeah, I think there's a number of practical ways you can help build a board culture, a positive board culture. You might have other suggestions, as I say, so do add them in the chat as we go, so we can all learn from each other. Wait a minute, that hasn't worked. Bear with me. Where is she? Right. Okay. So a good place to start is with the Scottish Governance Code, which, along with SCVO's own good governance checkup, I would encourage you all to use with your board as a way of exploring how you as individual trustees and as the board collectively can demonstrate good governance. Now, the code references all the points on this slide and is a great tool to support continuous improvement and strengthen the effectiveness of governance across our sector. I'm going to look at conflicts of interest and codes of conduct in more detail in a moment, but I would say that clarity on your role and responsibilities is vital as a trustee, and you've all identified that. So knowing the difference between governance and management is key, and that can help avoid tension, both with other trustees and with staff. And to sum up, really, governance is about oversight and planning. Management is about taking care of the daily operations. So to get the balance right, so the board focuses on that oversight and strategy rather than operations, it's vital as a trustee you do know your role and responsibilities well, and you also understand the importance of boundaries. So you should have clear role descriptions for trustees, terms of reference for any subcommittees, and also a scheme of delegation which provides clarity around who has authority to make different decisions. So getting back to the Scottish Governance Code, there are 5 core principles in the code, which are organisational purpose, leadership, board behaviour, control and effectiveness. This is the summary statement for the principle of board behaviour. And really, board behaviour, both collectively and individually, can have a far-reaching impact on an organisation's reputation and success. And in all my years, probably too many to think of working on the information service at SCVO, I've seen too many organisations damaged by bad behaviour, really, where that mutual respect, integrity, openness and accountability have been sadly lacking. And that's why behaviour is a core principle in the Scottish Governance Code. And this is how the code suggests you can demonstrate and implement the principle by being transparent and open and accountable, promoting equality and diversity, listening and handling concerns and complaints. And the 2 that I've highlighted here, recognising and acknowledging where conflicts of interest might arise and creating a constructive board environment where diverse and at times conflicting views are respected and welcomed and decisions are reached collectively. So how do you recognise and acknowledge where conflicts of interest may arise? Well, I would say sometimes you can't avoid conflicts of interest on a board because trustees are often committed and energetic individuals who might sit on a number of boards or be loyal to particular community interests. So it's important not to panic if your board is faced with a conflict of interest. It's not about trying to prevent it, it's how you manage it that matters. And a good starting point here is for every trustee to always keep in mind while they're on the board, they're there to serve the best interests of the organisation and not to follow their own agenda. And they have to be able to put aside any differences to protect the future of their own organisation. So ways to evidence that you're dealing with conflicts of interest or what are on the slide here, and these are all from the SCVO Good Governance Checkup. So it's about making time and space to discuss conflicts of interest and also conflicts of loyalty so that you can develop a written policy that everyone understands and can adhere to. Drawing up a register of interests, and you must keep that up to date annually. Any new trustees that join, they should be filling that in. Have a conflicts of interest as a standing item on your agenda. And obviously, if you've got any declared conflicts of interest, you include these in the minutes. And of course, if trustees do have a conflict, they shouldn't be taking part in discussions or decisions about that particular topic. And what about dealing with conflicts between trustees? Well, differences of opinion, again, they're common on a board. Trustees are there to challenge, and that's what they should be doing. And it's good to have different points of view because that's how you get good decision making. But obviously that can lead to potential disharmony. So it's important that you manage that healthy debate in a positive way and create that constructive board environment where different views, conflicting views are respected and welcomed, and the decisions are reached collectively. Because every trustee brings different skills and experience to a board, but they've all got equal legal and financial responsibility and are collectively responsible for making sure the organisation's properly run. So you've got to have no factions or cliques on your board, and you have to reach collective majority decisions. Sometimes trustees won't agree with the decision, and in that case, you should register their dissent and get it minuted. But as soon as you go out the door, you have to present a united front as soon as you leave that meeting. A good chair can help here, to make sure all trustees' voices are heard equally, and to create that open culture of trust and support and a safe space to challenge. I think this can be difficult in an online environment. If you've got new trustees that they don't really know each other that well. So you've got to get creative, for example, by using smaller breakout rooms at the start of meetings for discussion and thinking about how you can build a team. And if you're managing to do all this well, then that should be evidenced in your minutes. And you should get your trustees to sign up to a code of conduct. And this should outline expected standards of behaviour. For example, attendance at meetings, the importance of maintaining confidentiality, and what happens if these standards are not met. So that's it from me. I'll make sure you get the slides with further links to resources, which are here. But now I'm going to hand over to May. But I would encourage you to use the Q&A facility as we go, and we'll take questions at the end, and also the chat box to share your own experiences and thoughts. So over to you now, May. Thank you. All right, May, you're on mute there.
That's my Zoom trick. I always start on mute. So hopefully everybody can see the slides. Thanks, Tracy. I'm May, and I'm a project officer with Scottish Mediation. And for the past 5 years, I've been responsible for our third sector project, which provides mediation to charities and voluntary organisations. What I'd like to do today is to give you some idea of what mediation is all about, and at the same time give you some tips and ideas for avoiding and dealing with conflict within the board. It was really interesting looking at your answers to the poll, and I think we've seen all of these, all the reasons that were in the poll in third sector mediations. But I think that at least one of the top 3, which is personality clashes, poor communications, and roles and responsibilities, which has already been mentioned a couple of times, I think there's always going to be at least one of these involved somewhere in every conflict that we come across, even if they don't present as the main cause at the start. It's not surprising that around a third of the cases we deal with involve a board in some way. Boards can be made up of people from very different backgrounds and experiences, and very often they're passionate about the work of the charity. Unfortunately, this can help escalate disagreements into major disputes, especially where communications are poor, or once again, there's a blurring of roles and responsibilities. And this isn't just stressful for everybody, and it can be incredibly stressful. But valuable individuals can choose to walk away from the stress rather than put up with it. And in some cases, the situation can jeopardize the reputation and the future of the whole organisation. Now, we've already referred to the video about Handforth Parish Council and Jackie Weaver, which hopefully most of you have seen. If you haven't, Google it when we're finished and have a little look at it. And this is perhaps an extreme example of board behaviour, but it does show how inappropriate behaviour can completely disrupt meetings and prevent business being done. It also highlights the importance of having clarity in roles and responsibilities. Are you the secretary or a proper officer? Still don't know what a proper officer is, but there we go. And how a narrow focus on rules and regulations can prevent any meaningful discussion. Now, rules and regulations are very important. Your governance code is very important. But I'm sure you've all come across the person who keeps quoting, but in section 4.38, it says you can't do this and so on. And it very often just puts a barrier up and stops decent conversation taking place. So there is a balance there. So as trustees, what can you do to avoid issues arising and to prevent them escalating? There's one thing that I think often gets overlooked and something that COVID has made particularly challenging, and that is getting to know people socially. Try to spend some time talking about things that have absolutely nothing to do with business. In normal times, we all network at the start and finish of meetings or at social events. And that allows you to get to know people a bit better. And this is much more difficult with COVID, but there are a number of ways to do this. Sorry, there we go. So in Scottish Mediation, we have a weekly coffee break on Zoom. And we ban talk about work, so we don't talk about work at all. We even had a virtual Christmas party. You could also maybe run a quiz or another activity. And if you do something like that, ideally try and put people into breakout rooms to chat. So in Zoom and in Microsoft Teams now, you can very easily split people into smaller groups. And it's much easier to talk to people on Zoom if there's just 2 or 3 people there, rather than a whole boardroom. So if you are looking at activities, try and do something that involves splitting people up so they can get to know each other better. And a good idea is to ask people to join about 15 minutes before the meeting is due to start and put them straight away into random breakout rooms so they can chat with 2 or 3 people in the same way that they would do before a normal meeting. The point about all this is that the more you know somebody and understand the issues and interests that they may have in their life, the less likely it is that when conflict arises, you'll allow it to escalate. Okay? And this informal chat can also allow issues to be raised or spotted at an early stage when it's easier to resolve them. It's always much easier to resolve conflict the earlier you can get at it. So when conflict does arise, it's important to understand how it affects people. And at our workshops, we ask people to think of 3 words that they associate with conflict. Now, I'd like you to do that. Imagine in your mind a difficult conflict situation that you've been in or that you've observed from the outside, and think of 3 words that you would associate with that scenario. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you what they are. So this slide shows the responses that we've had at workshops to all sorts of different audiences. And I'd be surprised if you don't see at least one of the words you thought of. The red words are negative, the blue are neutral, and if there were any green ones, they would be positive. Okay. As Tracy said, there is a positive side to conflict. There is an argument that you wouldn't get any change or progression without conflict, but it's how that conflict is handled that's important. And it's worth remembering that when we're talking to the people involved in a dispute, they are likely to be feeling some of these emotions, as you may be too, even if you're not directly involved. It's actually quite stressful trying to sort out other people's disputes. And all these emotions in the background is likely to get in the way of good communications and understandings. And that certainly happened in Handsworth. I think there are some very helpful lessons that we can take from mediation to avoid conflict and nip it in the bud. So what is mediation? Mediation is simply using an independent third party, the mediator, to support both parties in finding a solution to the issues they're facing. And the parties may be individuals, they may be groups, they may even be organisations. At the moment, with lots of organisations trying to work in partnership, we're finding a number of issues arising coming out of that, because it's quite difficult having when two cultures clash sometimes. The mediator helps people work out and express what their issues are, and then explore what options might be available for moving forward. In most other dispute resolution processes, so I'm thinking of discipline, grievance, complaints procedures, tribunals, courts, the solution is decided by a third party, and both parties have to agree to that. The problem is that although there may appear to be a winner, the solution might suit neither party. Any perceived win can be short-lived, and the adversarial nature of the process that the parties have been through is likely to have damaged any future relationship. And that's especially important where people have to continue to work with each other. So whilst a mediator is a third party, they're not the decision maker. They don't make judgments, they're independent, and their role is to help the parties to work through the issues themselves and agree mutually acceptable solutions. Mediation is also a forward-thinking process. It focuses on impact, what's happening now, and what parties would like to happen in the future. It takes the heat out of things. It lets people speak about their situation in their own words and looks at how relationships can be maintained where that's appropriate. Now, mediation can take many forms, but usually it follows 5 steps. And these steps they're not always completely discrete, and they can move about a little bit depending on how the mediation's going, but all 5 stages will be covered in any mediation. And there are tips that we can gain from all of those steps that you can use in any disagreement or dispute. So what I'd like to do is to go through each of those stages and pick up some tips and hints from them that you might find useful. So the first one is the ground rules. And one of the first things that a mediator does is to create a safe environment where people feel that they can talk freely and confidentially without worrying about repercussions. And I think Tracy's already mentioned the importance of confidentiality in a board scenario. Making sure that your organisation has a clear route for everybody, including board members, to raise concerns in confidence is a good first step. If you can foster and demonstrate a supportive, non-judgmental and no blame culture, that will also allow differences and issues to be aired at an early stage when they're much easier to resolve. Tracy's also mentioned respect, and treating each other respectfully is really important. And you can encourage this generally within the organisation and the board by setting an example of behaviour standards yourself and challenging and nipping in the bud any persistent poor behaviour. Don't just say, oh, that's just Johnny, he's always like that, you know. Don't let it go. Now, while this naturally falls to the chair, if they don't pick it up, don't just leave it. You might want to discuss it with them to discuss how you can tackle it. But similarly, if the problem is the chair, which believe it or not sometimes happens, and consider Handsworth again, then you may need to tackle that. Discuss it again with them if possible. And everybody in the board has a responsibility in this respect, right? It's not just the chair has a prime responsibility, but if that's not happening, everybody should be looking at how this can be nipped in the bud. Confidentiality, which was mentioned, really important. I've come across many cases where the procedure for dealing with a complaint or a concern is to raise it and discuss it with the whole board, even if some board members are directly involved. In most cases, this in itself has made the situation worse. Now we're going to be looking at a mediation that we had just before COVID, where the relationship between the chair and the secretary of a charity had reached the point that they both felt that they just could not work together any longer. And one of the problems with that situation was that the whole situation had been played out in front of the full board, which meant that everyone was getting stressed, the board was splitting into factions, everyone was putting their penny in, and very little business got done. Again, think about Handsworth. So unless the issue is purely a strategic difference, it is preferable, at least initially, to contain any discussions to the parties immediately involved and the person who's either hearing the complaint or trying to help resolve the dispute. And the role of that person is important. The role of a mediator is that they are impartial and non-judgmental. So it's, if possible, it's preferable to have someone who's not involved in the dispute or closely aligned with either party to facilitate any discussions. What's important is that parties don't have the perception of the third party being more closely assigned with the other side. And even if you think you can overcome that and act completely fairly, it's the perception that you might not that might be a barrier to getting things resolved. Now, my background was in workplace mediation, and way back when mediation started to happen a lot in workplaces 10, 15 years ago, a lot of organisations trained up their HR specialists as mediators, because that seemed to be the place where mediation sat most comfortably. And in an awful lot of cases, it just didn't work. And the reason it didn't work was that even though the mediator had been fully trained and was perfectly capable of acting completely fairly and even-handedly, the perception was that HR was part of management. And therefore, it could be extremely difficult even to get people to the mediation table, never mind when they were involved in it. So it's not you, it's not saying anything against you, that you might not be the best person to deal with this, but if you are closer to one party or the other, or if you share views more with one party than the other, it is better if you can step aside and find somebody who's seen to be a little bit more objective. And make sure that everybody, including yourself, understands your role in helping them to resolve the conflict. You're not there to judge or take sides. So the next stage is uninterrupted speaking time. Now, in mediation, this is done in a joint session so that both parties can hear the other side's story. However, it's probably better for you to hear the stories separately, at least in the first instance. Getting the parties together can be a tricky job and can need a lot of skills. So certainly in most cases, it's better to try and deal with the situation separately to start with. It's important for people to feel that they've had the opportunity to tell their story or put their case, and that it has been listened to. So try to set aside some time with each party, even if you think you know what their story is. Okay. Active listening skills are amongst the most important skills of a mediator, and it's equally important when you're trying to sort out any sort of dispute. Remember that the aim is to hear what they have to say. All the time you're talking, you're not listening. Okay? We've all heard of, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should be listening much more than you're speaking. Try not to interrupt too much, and definitely try not to jump in with quick solutions, which is very tempting, I know. But try and bite your tongue until you've heard the full stories and perhaps done a little bit of investigation, questioning around them. Allowing people to vent is very important. And if you can do that calmly, without too many interruptions, you can find that they may start to run out of steam a bit, and it puts them in a much better frame of mind for any subsequent discussions. Now, in the mediation that we've mentioned, neither party had actually heard the full story from the other, because before every conversation beforehand had quickly got heated and resulted in one party just shutting down and giving up, which very often happens if people feel that they're in a bullying situation. So it's very powerful to let people have their talk right the way through without interruption. So stage 3 is actually the meat of the mediation. And in mediation, this usually involves the mediator facilitating a discussion between the two parties. But again, you might want to continue with separate sessions, at least with part of this. And having heard each story, you'll want to ask some questions, another key skill for mediators. Now, often when a conflict is recognised, the parties are already fairly entrenched positions. And this little diagram shows two parties in conflict. It could be individuals, it could be groups, it could be organisations. And you can see that the gap between their starting positions is quite wide, and that the likelihood of bridging that gap is pretty remote. So if you think about, again, the case that we're looking at, the positions where the secretary thought the chair's a bully, steamrollers over everyone at meetings, and is stopping the charity progress. If she doesn't go, I will, and I'll take the rest of the board with me. The chair, on the other hand, thought the secretary is a troublemaker and is stirring up discontent and disrupting the board. He's completely unreasonable and there's no way I can work with him. If he doesn't like the way we do things, he needs to step down. So they may well have gone over these positions many times, and each time they do, they get a bit more entrenched. Now, you'll probably want to clarify some facts, but just be aware that if you do that, it's concentrating on what's happened in the past. And you cannot change what's happened in the past. Asking questions about what's happened can just reinforce these positions and even force them further apart, because they just go over their position again and again. It just gets them more entrenched. One of the most powerful tools in resolving conflict is encouraging the parties to talk about the impact that the situation is having on them. And this brings the focus into the present. Very often people don't realise the impact of their behaviour, and just having that pointed out can have a positive effect on the discussions. Try to shift the focus to the future. What do they want to happen? What do they need? And by asking questions about impact and goals, you should be able to move down these pyramids and identify some underlying interests. And you might find that some of these are complementary or shared. So in the third sector, one common underlying interest, which is in nearly every case, is that both want the charity to continue and to thrive. And both want to do what's best for their client group. And this was certainly the case for the chair and the secretary in the case we're talking about. So in addition to interests, a mediator will also try to establish what basic needs are important to the parties that are not being met. So these are very simple things and we all have them. For example, there's a need to be listened to, the need to be treated fairly and with respect, the need to be valued, and for your role or your status to be recognised. And when these needs are not met, it can drive and fuel the conflict and can add the negative feelings that we've already mentioned. So in our case, the secretary felt that he wasn't being listened to, he wasn't being treated with respect, and his views were not being valued. His contribution was not being valued. And the chair felt that she was being treated really unfairly because the secretary kept going behind her back, and she didn't feel that her status as chair was being respected. Now, another mediator skill that's used in this part of the mediation, the exchange part, but also really throughout mediation, is something called reframing. So I'd like you to have a look at this picture and have a think about whether the window is opening in or out. So let's look at the top half. Is it opening in or out now? And what about if you look at the bottom half? And back to the full picture. Okay, so is it in or out? You probably realise now that whether it's in or out depends on where you focus. Okay. And this is a visual illustration of the positions that people take, which are based on their perceptions. They put a frame around what they perceive, and they only see the problem or the issue from their own point of view. And because of this, they can very easily assume that the other party is lying. And once that word is introduced into a disagreement, it immediately makes it more difficult to resolve. It is a red rag to a bull. So one of the key skills in resolving conflict is helping people to at least understand other perspectives. They don't have to agree, just realise that the other party may reasonably see things differently. Reframing is also about taking the heat out of the language being used. And language can get very heated if you're in a conflict situation. And it's about expressing concerns in a more constructive way. One way of doing this is to break down negative expressions, such as bullying, harassment, browbeating, steamrollering perhaps, tormenting, intimidate, aggressive. All of this helps to escalate a conflict when it's used. But if you break it down by asking what specific behaviours this is describing, and then working on those behaviours, this helps to separate the deed from the doer and removes negative words. And there's a useful little tool that can be used in all sorts of situations to express feelings in a more measured way, which is less likely to attract an aggressive or defensive response. And that's something called winner. Now, looking back at our case, the mediator was told the chair is a bully and just steamrollers over everyone else. And when the mediator asked for examples of the specific behaviours that this was describing, one of them was that the chair continually silenced people at board meetings by raising her hand, palm first at them. Try and get that on camera. So the mediator encouraged the secretary to use winner during the exchange to express his feelings. And what he came up with was, when you hold up your hands towards me to stop me talking in a board meeting, I feel frustrated, angry, and humiliated. I need you to listen and understand what I'm saying. And can I ask you not to silence people with that gesture and to let people have their say? So the chair hadn't realised that this gesture was so irritating and offensive. And she took it on board without the defensive aggression, which had been her reaction to being called a bully. No one believes they're a bully. And usually people are very offended by the suggestion and it puts the hackles up. So winner is a really useful little tool, and I'd advise you to go away and think about it a bit. It works in all sorts of different situations. I am reliably informed it does not work with teenage children. That's the only situation where I don't think it works. But otherwise, it can work with almost everything. Okay, so another couple of tips on reframing. Use the person's name rather than he or she when you're talking about the situation. Very often, when you're in conflict, you forget that the other party is a person, that they've got feelings and interests and issues and all sorts of things. You tend to demonize them a bit. So using people's names brings that down, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to have that aggressive response. And the second one's one I found a bit strange to start with, but it's replacing but or however with and. And the thing is, the word but negates or cancels everything that goes before it. And it's generally accepted as a signal that the really important part of the sentence is coming up, and that is usually a negative. So if I say anything, da, 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 but, you expect what's coming next, it will be negative, and you expect it's more important than what came before. And it's what I'm really thinking. If you say the same thing and, that's quite neutral, and it doesn't have the same negative effect. Strange but true. Try it and see if it works. So the next stage is exploring options. Once you've heard the full stories from either side, it's a good idea to set out exactly what the issues are. And this allows you to tackle them one at a time and not get bogged down. And it also ensures that both sides agree on the issues. Try and pick the easiest one first, as this will add some positivity and encouragement to the process. And by focusing on impact and goals, you should be able to start to identify those shared or complementary interests that we spoke about. And these in turn should generate some ideas for potential solutions. Another useful little tool is stop, start, continue. Okay? And this usually produces some ideas about solutions. And because you're asking about something to continue, it means they must be doing something right. So you ask each side to come up with something they'd like the other one to stop, to start, and continue. And in our little case, the secretary wanted the chair to stop interrupting so much, to start to listen and consider other points of view, but to continue to represent the charity locally and politically. The chair wanted the secretary to stop talking to other board members behind her back and encouraging them to oppose her plans, to start to make constructive suggestions as to how the plans could be improved, but to continue to draft fundraising applications for the charity. So this highlighted the communications issues, but it recognised that both had complementary skills that were of value to the charity and were valued by each other. And it showed a shared interest in moving the charity forward. So solutions are much more powerful if they come from the parties themselves, rather than being suggested or imposed by anyone else. And this is one of the secrets of success of mediation, because the mediator helps the parties to work things out. Try not to jump in too quickly, as I've said, but encourage them to come up with the ideas themselves. And any solution need to address the underlying interests that we spoke of earlier, but they also need to take into consideration those underlying needs. So if anyone comes out of the process feeling some of these needs have not been satisfied, it's unlikely that any agreement will last. If they feel they haven't been listened to, they're still not being valued, for example. So the final stage in any successful mediation is the agreement. And this will include the actions that both parties have agreed. And we try to make them SMART. My version of SMART is specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, so that you can measure them, you can check that things are working as they should do. But most importantly, as mediation is completely confidential, an agreement about who can be told what also has to be agreed. And the agreement should also include something about what people should do if the same sort of issues arise in the future to prevent it escalating. So both of these are also worth considering in any more informal process. In our case, and I have to say it was a bit more complex than we've had time to look at today, but the agreement included the chair would stop using that offensive gesture, the secretary would bring any issues directly to the chair, stop going behind their back. They would set up a working group to look at a specific strategic issue that had actually brought the conflict to a head, and the working group would consider and evaluate the full range of views and options. The chair would mention at the next board meeting that they'd had constructive discussions and were looking forward to working together to help the charity move forward. And that if either felt there was an issue in the future that had the potential to cause similar disagreements, they'd meet for a coffee and work out a way forward using the open communications that they'd discovered during the mediation. So hopefully I've given you 1 or 2 tips, and hopefully you'll be able to handle most conflicts locally. But sometimes professional mediation might help. And there are lots of benefits to bringing in a completely independent and professional mediator. And we've touched on most of them as we've gone through. I'm not going to go through all of them. Most important for me, puts the people involved in control of the outcome. That is why mediation is successful. It's much quicker than most other forms of sorting out disputes. Very important for the third sector, it reflects core values such as respect and working cooperatively, all the stuff you've got in your code of governance. There may be outcomes that can be agreed, which formal processes couldn't award. And again, most importantly, it helps to build positive relationships for the future. If you have an issue that might be helped by mediation, the first step is to call us, Scottish Mediation, call our helpline. At the moment, it's better to email because our helpline's on an answer machine, so you'll get a quicker response to an email. You can always set up a phone call afterwards. And we'll discuss the case in confidence with you and provide information on the mediation process. If mediation is appropriate and both parties are willing to participate, because mediation is voluntary, we'll then appoint a mediator from amongst our fully qualified and experienced members to take forward the mediation with you. All the information and contact details are on our website. Just Google Scottish Mediation. And the costs differ depending on the size of the organisation. So if your annual income is up to £50,000, you'll be given free mediation for up to a day. Most mediations are cleared in a day or the equivalent of a day. If your income is between £50,000 and £250,000, the fee is capped at £300 for 1 day. And if you're above £250,000, it is our standard helpline fee, which is £100 an hour. At the moment, we've got a COVID-19 service, which offers free or reduced cost mediations for issues that have arisen or been made worse by COVID. Now, that might be something as simple as they haven't been able to sort the issue out because they can only meet through Zoom and they're not comfortable doing that. That's it being made worse by COVID. And that's interesting because all the mediations there are capped at £300. So there are free mediations for smaller organisations, but for the larger organisations who would normally be paying £100 an hour, if it's COVID related, it would be capped at £300 a day. So that's worth knowing about. This will go on till the end of March. I can't promise it will last beyond the end of March. We're still looking at that at the moment. The third sector project has been running for 5 years and will run on for the foreseeable future, I hope. And all mediations at the moment are either online or by phone. And finally, I've mentioned our workshops. If you're interested in learning more about mediation techniques that you can use yourself when dealing with difficult situations, then you might be interested in a 3-hour online workshop that we run from time to time. It's 3 hours, it has got breaks in it though, and we usually have 3 presenters, so you're not listening to me droning on for 3 hours. It is very participative. We use breakout rooms, we use Google Jamboard, which is like a whiteboard, to get participation. So it's definitely not sitting listening to anybody for 3 hours. And it very much draws on mediation techniques, some of which we've mentioned today, but a lot more. So that is all I would like to say. And I'm very happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Mia, that was great. A lot in there that I probably will use in my personal life, I think, as well as working with boards, but I won't try it on the teenagers. put your questions. We've got some questions that were submitted beforehand, but I would like, if you've got any tonight, just to put them in the Q&A. Julie, what did you think of that? I mean, we've all probably had some really bad stories over the years.
And it makes me just remind me of the importance of how a chair handles these situations when they're witnessing that, perhaps in a dialogue between trustees, and how critical the role of chair is in trying to diffuse and use some of those language points that you've mentioned, May. So that was really interesting to hear. Thank you.
Apart from when the problem is the chair.
That's the difficult one. That is the difficult one. And sadly, it very often is, particularly if it's a founder chair who's actually set the charity up and is so passionate about it. It can get very difficult. Yeah. Yes, and very entrenched in their views. And then you get new trustees coming along, maybe wanting to move the organisation in a certain direction. Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, I'll just have a look at some of the questions that we got in from people beforehand. And there was one that was quite interesting. They were saying the board would be doubling in size from when they started as a trustee 3 years ago. And they're a diverse board, they're well running, and they've worked together even during lockdown. But they want to continue to do that. So when you're bringing new trustees on and you're doubling size, hopefully you're not going to double the problem. So have you got any tips for that? To get people together? And yeah, I mean, I think it's great if you've got a well-running board. Great, have a look at what makes it so good, and do more of it. So find out why is it running well and do more of it. And I think it's all about making people feel welcome, and also very clear about their roles and responsibilities, which keeps coming up as a real issue, so making sure that people fully understand that, without totally overwhelming them with information. I've seen some board introduction packs which are so comprehensive that it would make me run away and lie down in a darkened room, because they're this size. So drip feed it. There's a lot that people have to get to know, particularly if they're completely new board members who haven't been on boards before. Don't overwhelm them with them all at once. Understanding, getting to know them and understanding their background is useful. That's likely to influence how they approach the board. A lot of issues in boards are because you've got people coming from well, say in the case that we mentioned that we were talking about, the chair was an entrepreneur. She'd built up her own business, so she was used to doing that. The secretary came from a corporate background, so was used to having, much more sharing and discussion and things. So it can be quite difficult. And I think particularly in charities where you may have some people coming from the local community and other people coming from a business background, that can be quite difficult. So understanding that's good. And the old social activity is really important. Try and work something in about that. You could even consider a buddy system, which might be an idea. Or even a quiz. You could have a quiz based on your governance code. I'm sure Tracy could help you with that. And that would help to introduce the new members. It would refresh the other members who may have forgotten a bit about it, and it would give you the opportunity to use breakout rooms and teams and have a bit of fun. So, but just if you're doing something right, make sure you don't throw that out with the bathwater. Yeah, build on that, definitely. Yeah. There was another question about should all members of the board contribute to all discussions and decisions, or is there a place for working groups even with a small charity? I would say all members of the board should contribute to decision making, definitely. But from my point of view, yeah, subcommittees, working groups, definitely. What do you think, May? Yes, again, it is another good opportunity for people to get to know each other if they're working in smaller groups. So that's great. The only word of caution, I worked with a charity a few years ago, and they had the most complicated board structure. of boards and subcommittees and working groups and work groups, all the best intention. But they all, it took up the whole, the whole work of the board, because there was so much. Every working group, every working party, every subcommittee had their own comprehensive minutes, which were all gone over in great detail at the board. And the working groups would decide that they wanted to do something, but the decision had to be made by the board, and they didn't want to do that. So there are dangers, and that particular charity slimlined, and they still have committees, they still have subcommittees, working groups, but it's much more slimlined. People are much clearer about their level of accountability and what they can decide and what they can't decide. And it doesn't all get regurgitated all the time, because at the start, in that particular case, the business never got done at all, because it just kept going over and over the same things from the groups. So yes, it's a great idea, but just be careful how you manage it. So.
Yeah. Great. Well, there's no questions coming in, and we're just about at the end of the session. So I hope you've all found that useful. I certainly have. We'll email out the slides that I used, and also May's, in the next few days. And I would encourage you to join the SCVO Trustee Network if you haven't already. And you can find more details about that on our website. So thanks again to May and to Julie and to everyone for joining us today. Our next webinar will be at the beginning of May, and we'll be looking at climate change and what trustees can do about that within their organisation. So do join us for that one, and there's details on the SCVO website about that. Thanks again, and good night.